I'm Loki Karuna, and this is TRILLOQUY. It's been a while. As I think I said last episode, life has been lifing, both good and on the more challenging side, but you got to take it how you take it. As a matter of fact, I'm joining you right now from a hotel room in some city in some part of the country. My travel schedule has been so intense that it's hard for me to keep up sometimes, but I am extremely grateful for all of the opportunities that I've been given to go around and spread the message of decolonizing classical music, at the very least, expanding the way that we think about classical music. I mean, I could shout out all of the different partners and the different folks that I've had the opportunity to collaborate with, but I would forget someone, so I won't. So a huge shout out to each and every one of you for joining me here this week. As I work on catching up, I have a huge backlog of interviews that I need to release to the public, release to y'all. So I'll be working on that as quickly as I can in the midst of all the early summer, late spring travel. You know, my work with the American Composers Orchestra has really given me an inside look that I've realized few other people have. It's like traveling to Oz and looking behind that curtain finally. I'll say more on that in the Triloquy, but for now, I'd like to go ahead and jump into today's feature, Maestro Kwamé Ryan. He was born in Canada and raised in Trinidad. That's where his musical journeys began. He studied in Europe, he guest conducted around the world, and he's recently been named the music director of the Charlotte Symphony. We're seeing more and more Black conductors take the podium here in the good old US of A, and thanks to the Charlotte Symphony, there's one more. Hope y'all enjoy our chat today. To get us into this conversation, I thought I'd share a little classical music. You know, according to Trinidad and Tobago, of course. This tune here is called Portrait of Trinidad. It's performed by the National Steel Symphony Orchestra of Trinidad and Tobago. Hope y'all enjoy it, and hope y'all enjoy my chat with Maestro Kwamé Ryan.
Well, I think it's true that representation is becoming broader in our industry, or has already become broader. And that's a very positive development. And from my perspective, it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario, because I think increased awareness of the importance and the impact of more diversity in programming and more equal opportunity, more representation has become apparent. And many orchestras are sort of reaping the rewards of what that has done in terms of inspiring up-and-coming composers and inspiring conductors and soloists. And that sort of cycle makes the inclusion and the representation more and more organic over time. And that's what I think audiences are seeing now and are totally up for.
And I think we've done a really great job of making the point that anyone from any background can write music or play music or conduct music, but representation in audiences hasn't kept up to the same pace as what's been going on the stage. I wonder if we need to revisit the conversation of the universality of orchestral music. Can this art form really relate to anyone?
Well, perhaps not. I mean, I don't think any source of any consumable product is necessarily right for everyone. That would be, too utopian a goal. I think the important thing is to represent as full a range as possible of the medium's potential, the medium being the orchestra. And fortunately for us, the orchestra is truly, chameleonic. You only need to look at the place of the orchestra in popular culture to see that. I think the most important sign of its potentially universal appeal is to look at its use as a tool in storytelling, in cinema, where you find everything from your horror films to your fantasy films, your children films, all underscored with the orchestra. So I don't think it's a question of whether the orchestra is universal. The orchestra in itself is, like a computer without an operating system. It's just a tool. The question is, what's being composed, what's being played by the orchestras, and to what extent can we make that appeal to as many constituencies as possible, and make that something that is really as inclusive as it can be.
So considering all of the different pieces that it takes to really get orchestra concerts and experiences to a public, whether it's marketing, education initiatives, all of those things, with all of that considered, I wonder what you consider your most effective tool for bridging that gap between, the folks who come to orchestra concerts all the time and those who have never considered. What's really the power of a conductor in that equation?
Well, the ultimate power that conductors have is the power of sort of choice and decision making. And I think part of that is being true to who you are and your background and what inspires you, genuinely what you like. I don't think there's any point in putting up something for someone to consume, no more so on a concert stage than in a restaurant as a chef,
Mm.
that you wouldn't want to eat. Why would you do that? So you be true to your own taste, but then you also sort of observe what people are interested in because it's a business. And so you definitely need to serve, different uh, ranges of taste, but all within that overarching idea of what you think is good and what you think is worth listening to and worth performing for people to consume.
Your food analogy makes me think about your unique upbringing. I'm sure you had some really good food coming up in Trinidad.
For sure. And it was a very diverse range of food because growing up in Trinidad, the pretty much 50% of the population is of African origin. Nigh on the other 50% is of Indian origin. And, that uh, those little percentages that fall off the edge, those are your, your Eastern population, your Creole population, your European population. So, the cuisine in Trinidad and Tobago was very, very rich and very delicious.
What about the music? I wonder if you can talk about the musical diversity that you experienced coming up.
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate that I grew up in a very musically sort of eclectic household. My parents were both avid music lovers. They had a very large collection of vinyl that included not only classical music, but also lots of pop and calypso and jazz. And I had free reign of that. And I mean, I also, at the time that I was growing up, there was a fair amount of Indian music programming, classical Indian music programming on TV. I grew up truly believing, not because I was told, but because I experienced it, that no music belongs to anybody. The
Mhm,
music, all music belongs to everybody. And just because it's perhaps Indian music and I'm not Indian doesn't mean it's not my music.
mhm.
Just because, by extension, it's Beethoven, it's European, and I'm not European, doesn't mean it's not my music. It was all my music in my experience, and that's something that I sort of took forward to my practice of music and my choices of music as a purveyor of musical entertainment.
How did classical happen specifically? I mean, you didn't become a calypso star or an Indian classical musician. I wonder if you could talk about that journey.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, my parents were music lovers. My mom, in particular, loves Bach and Wagner and Mozart. I can actually remember her sort of taking me by the hand and sitting me in front of our stereo setup and playing me Mozart piano works and explaining as much as she understood about them to me when I was in single digits of age. And then there were a couple of major sort of, I would say, orchestral sparks for me, not necessarily even classical, but definitely orchestral. One of them was going to see and therefore hear Star Wars for the first time
Mm.
with my family and just being completely blown away by the soundtrack and the power of the orchestra, which of course in the cinema you can't see. But at that time there was a Trinidad and Tobago Opera Society that did an opera production once a year. So I had seen an orchestra, but it was like one time a year in my early years. And then fortunately, the other sort of really sparking orchestral experience for me was that my parents, having studied in Toronto, used to take my sister and me on summer holidays back to Toronto once we were living in Trinidad. And on one of these summer holidays, they took us to Ontario Place to hear an orchestral concert, and it was Porgy and Bess.
Mm.
And that was the moment where I leaned over to my mom and said, Mom, whatever the guy at the front is doing, whatever that guy's doing, I want to do that.
Not the people on stage.
No, the other people, well, the guy at the front was the guy sort of in the middle conducting the orchestra. I didn't even know what he was called. I didn't know what that was. I just knew that that seemed to be the guy that had the magic wand that was making the music. And to her credit, she took this, what was I, six-year old
Mm.
seriously enough to say, okay, well, when we get home from this holiday, we'll get you a piano and you can start there. And so that was the beginning of my journey in classical music. It was Star Wars, Porgy and Bess, and then a piano.
That's a really interesting entry point, especially with the Porgy and Bess. I mean, having that level of representation on your radar, in your periphery, that must have played a specific role, had a specific impact on your trajectory from there.
Well, looking back, you might think so, but at the time, as I say, my parents raised my sister and me very much to feel empowered and to feel very matter of fact with regard to what we were entitled to.
Mm.
And so it didn't occur to me that Porgy and Bess, that, the representation back then, that wasn't a thing. That
Right.
wasn't a word, in that context anyway. But the representation on that stage didn't have any meaning to me. It was just people on a stage making music, and it didn't matter what color their skin was because, as I said, my first experiences of opera were in Trinidad, albeit once a year, but everybody on stage had dark skin too, well, almost everybody. So that was what I was used to, albeit seldom, but it didn't strike a chord or change any perspective for me. That was just I took that for granted, which is something that I've been grateful for my entire career, just to have the space to take things that are not obvious in the real world for granted, at least as a child, at least in my developmental stage.
So was the scenery change going to Cambridge something that impacted you in any sort of way, considering your upbringing? There are so many Black folks who, you know, exist in this world in solitude. Even growing up as the only ones in school, it seems like that transition would have been jarring. It seems like it would have been jarring for me anyway. Maybe not for you, but
Well, I didn't go from Trinidad straight to Cambridge. I left Trinidad when I was 14 years old, 14 and a half,
Mhm.
because I had kind of reached the end of the line in terms of what I could learn in Trinidad on the path to becoming a conductor. And, in the 6 or 7 years between Porgy and Bess, and being in my mid-teens, or in my early teens, I really stepped on the gas in
Mm.
terms of my musical education, so that by the time I was 13, it was clear to my mother, at least, that I would need to go abroad.
Mhm.
And so I went to a boarding school. So I kind of had a soft transition because in the environment of a boarding school, it's very protected, it's very cloistered. And, if you're one of a tribe of musical children, then that's your tribe.
Mhm.
Um, and the fact that most of the people in that tribe don't have the same skin color as you is mitigated by the fact that everybody in that tribe is passionate about music.
Mm.
making music at a high level, and you gain your respect that way. And I had a scholarship, I had a couple of scholarships at school, and I was a respected student in my area. And again, a certain what should I call it? Constructive naivete persisted through my school years because I was in a tribe. I felt like I belonged, and obviously I was aware of forces in the real world that might potentially obstruct me. But because I was protected from that for so long, and privileged, I make no bones about it. I lived an extremely privileged life. I walked a very privileged path to being a professional musician. But I definitely benefited from not being fully exposed to the reality of the world until later.
A part of that reality of the world that I was certainly exposed to in my upbringing was the difficulty to enter the orchestral field as a professional. If there was anything that was made clear to me, it was how challenging it is to win that audition. So for me, it always was a maybe until I started winning those auditions and got into the field. And it just
As what? What are you playing? Just
oh, a
if I might
bassoonist.
ask.
Oh yeah, I'm a
Oh, you're a
bassoonist. Yeah.
bassoonist. Okay,
And
interesting.
and 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 when I think about that trajectory, I just think about the relationship between making sure that students understand the reality of this field versus really having that fearlessness and going out for what you want no matter what. All of that to ask the question, I wonder when becoming a conductor professionally was more than just an aspiration, but something that you were beginning to see as a reality for yourself.
I saw it as a reality from the very beginning. When I said to my mom, I want to do that,
Mhm.
it was on the assumption that I could do it. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't be able to do it. And to my mom's credit, I'll explain why I differentiate that way in a second. To my mom's credit, she also never doubted. I've asked her since, this crazy little kid telling you he wants to do that thing, and you know how the world works. You were a student in Canada in the 50s and the
Mhm.
60s. So you and dad knew. Did you ever doubt that I was going to be able to walk that path? And to this day, she says no. And that's the talk that she walked back then. It helped, of course, that she was not only a teacher, so she understood about motivation and empowerment when it came to children, but she was also an actress herself. So I grew up in the theater,
Oh wow.
watching her be on stage and sitting in rehearsals in the darkened theater and sending her notes and sending the director notes and you know I grew up in that environment and so I believed that I could do it and would do it from the start. It was just a question of how. And I had a lot of help, and some good fortune, both of which you need on any creative path, to be honest.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about your post with the Charlotte Symphony. Uh, First and foremost, what's it like settling into a new job? What are the first days of work like for for a conductor with an orchestra?
Well, to a certain extent, I've already had my first days of work. At the time, of course, I didn't have the job, but it's a kind of a unique situation where you are on trial
Hmm.
for the job and doing the job, essentially, at least a big part of it, the sort of core part of it, which is conducting the orchestra before you get the job.
Hmm.
So I conducted the Charlotte Symphony Orchestra first in January of last year. Very challenging program of mostly American music. And then again in November of last year with the Verdi Requiem, so massive choir and big orchestra and four soloists, so also pretty challenging. So that was our opportunity to get to know each other and to see what the chemistry was like and see what that working relationship would be like. So I feel like having now signed the contract and being part of the CSO family, I'm kind of hitting the ground running on the artistic side because I've already had two big experiences with the orchestra and felt really happy about that and feel really honored that the orchestra felt the same way. The other part of the job, I, I jest to my colleagues that I feel like I'm still in CSO school
Hmm.
um, because there's a whole load of stuff with regard to the community, with regard to our initiatives, ongoing projects, upcoming projects, some of which I will be charged with inventing, but some of which I will inherit.
Hmm.
Um, and certainly the sense of what the community needs and wants, something that I'm just getting started with. So a few days from now, from when we do this interview, I'll be on a plane back to Charlotte to start that work. I'll be conducting as well, but a lot of what I'm going to be doing next week will be meeting people, meeting communities, going to a university, and just getting a sense of where I'm doing the job as opposed to the content of the job itself.
I wonder if you'll say more on why that sort of work is important. Why does it matter that the community members know their music director's name, have shaken their music director's name? Why is it something other than waving a stick on the podium that is a part of your job?
Well, it comes down to how you want to engage with a current audience and a future audience.
Hmm.
You can't assume that the community at large will either, one, know what you're doing, or two, care about what you're doing. So a lot of the work, as I see it, given that you understand that there is an existing audience, is going to be about how to win more audience, and that comes with engaging with people and getting to know what moves them, what excites them. That way, as I say, you bring to that relationship what you like and what you are convinced you should be, offering people for their entertainment, but also get a sense of what they like, what they know they like, and what they're convinced that you should be offering them as entertainment. And then that gray area where neither of us knows, but
Hmm.
feel that we are excited about embarking on an adventure together to discover what we might all newly enjoy and be excited by as a musical experience. So that's why that part of the job, that getting to know you part of the job, is really important to me.
We've already talked about representation a little bit, but I'm sure it's not lost on you that being a Black conductor in your position is a big deal for a lot of people. Many people have never seen that before. I wonder how you engage that reality, considering what you've already shared about how normal it's always been for you to be in the spaces that you are, being who you are.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, having grown up in Europe, I've always been aware that I was a bit of a unicorn in my profession.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, it was important to me to do the job and not to get too wrapped up in the politics of identity beyond doing the job. And so, in my early career, I never really wanted to be tokenized or instrumentalized. I never considered myself an activist, and I
Mm-hmm.
kind of stayed away from the politics. Um, in the last, I don't know, maybe 12 years, not least of all during the time when was doing a lot of youth work in Great Britain, in France, and in Trinidad, where I was working at the University of Trinidad and Tobago's Academy for the Performing Arts for several years as its director. I came to understand firsthand the power of role modeling. And it was through that avenue that I found an authentic way for me of becoming active, if not an activist, in that question of what it means to be a Black conductor or to be a Black artist in a predominantly white industry.
Hmm.
But for me, it still always comes down to to actually doing and exemplifying, inspiring, helping, and perhaps less about talking about it. But the actual work is something that I've become really passionate about through the avenue of inspiring young people to, I guess, to do what I was empowered to do, which is to believe in myself and to not let doubt become obstructive, and not let a reality of the past become a sort of a shadow that that obstructs you
Hmm.
in achieving your dreams.
When I think about those points of inspiration, I think a lot about musical aesthetic that's coming from the stage, especially for folks whose first or second time it is coming to an orchestra. Is it
Mhm.
important, in your opinion, for newcomers to hear something familiar, to hear the Beethoven Five, the Vivaldi Spring? Is it important for them to hear a more contemporary aesthetic? How do you engage that specific aspect of the work again and sparking that curiosity and creating the second and third and fourth time audience member?
Well, I mean, I think there is, understandably, um, in some in the minds of some potential audience members for what we do, the idea that classical music is white music.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and fundamentally, I don't think that the origin of a product intrinsically suggests who it's for. I mean, that if we come back to the metaphor of food, that would be like saying Indian food is for Indians
Mm-hmm.
and French food is for the French, which would be tragic and ridiculous. Someone who loves Indian food,
Mm-hmm.
that would be tragic. Nobody says that because that's not true. And it's the same for music. So it comes down to, for me, encouraging people to give things that they don't know a chance. And that shape-shifting quality of the orchestra to take forms that are either culturally familiar to a certain demographic or not is an important tool. So one way of reducing the friction for people who are approaching the orchestra for the first time is to, first of all, not assume that they'll come to you. So, sometimes it's important to go to people, and that's why the CSO's mobile stage initiative is going to be incredibly important for us to, travel around the region and bring our product to audiences, which is a gesture that I think resonates in a very profound way. And then the next step, assuming that you will, if you choose your repertoire wisely and offer people various points of adhesion to your product, is to say, okay, that was just a taster. That was just one dish, if you
Mm-hmm.
like. That was just one menu that we can offer, but it gives you a sense of what you might experience if you come and see this, or if you come and hear this. So, making the right gestures, reducing the friction that may be, inherent in people's experience and their assumptions, and then dissolving those assumptions into something that's real for them that they can then make a future decision on.
And how do you engage within that conversation the intersection of music, maybe musical aesthetic, and culture? We can't play Shostakovich without thinking about Russia and his context and the government. We can say that for Copland, many composers. I wonder where you stand there. Is the and I guess I can point it specifically at some of the composers who have come to the scene in recent years, like Price and Bonds and Still. How important, from your view, is it to really highlight and maybe foreground the culture, the context that these human beings came from?
Well, first of all, I want to challenge the premise a little bit. I do think it's possible to listen to the music of Shostakovich and not think about the Stalinist regime. If you don't know about the history of the music, it's just sounds.
Mm,
And it conjures something perhaps in your imagination, but it might be something that's really personal to each person in the audience individually. They might say, "Oh, that's Shostakovich. That's some head-banging music. It really rocks. It's got rhythm. It's got," and they're not thinking about Stalin because maybe it wasn't on their radar. As an educated musician, that's what jumps into your mind. And with regard to the role that, historical Black composers play or can play in the development of the repertoire. Um, I guess part of the question one would ask, as one does for any composer, is why would we play that music now?
mm,
What is the relevance of that to an audience today? Um, and while I'm not certain that it's necessary to burden any composer with the responsibility to represent anything, or showcase anything, I do think that it's important for people of any time to benefit from the power of art, to look back at their history, and at the same time to assess the now, and at the same time to imagine what comes next. So I think it's important to have, for any composer of any ethnicity, of any constituency that we deem worth performing and worth listening to, um, I think it's important to understand how that presentation serves the audience to reflect, uh, to develop awareness, and also to imagine what the what comes next for them, for the art form, for the community, for the culture.
I appreciate your highlighting these questions of what comes next and talking about assessing the now. After about a decade of performing as a bassoonist professionally, I personally got a little bored with programming and got into media and radio, and that eventually led me to a world where I'm advocating for living composers and new music. That's what I spend most of my time doing. So we can talk about challenges of race and gender when it comes to programming, but that timeline conversation is also challenging. Living composers have such a hard time out here getting music programmed and getting the same attention that the historical composers get, despite their race, despite their gender. I wonder what your engagement is with new music and living composers. Is that something that you consider an important part of the orchestral experience, especially for new audiences?
Most definitely. I mean, just to take a half a step back, my first experiences as a professional conductor were in the area of new music. I happened to choose a teacher who was not only a specialist in the conducting of contemporary music, but a composer himself, a Hungarian guy called Peter Ötvös, who unfortunately recently died just last week. And so, yeah, he dropped me in the deep end of understanding the importance of new music for audiences. And I would say that, um, from a conductor's point of view, people, um, especially composers, understandably credit or blame conductors for the degree to which
Right.
new music is engaged by orchestras or not. Um, And I think it's important that we, as the artists who are charged with taking decisions for what people are listening to,
Hmm.
you know, uh, take the responsibility to leave a trace of our time in the repertoire. The same way that the composers that we now see as historical were leaving a trace of their time in the orchestral repertoire. These are all artifacts that can be enjoyed, or at least explored, if not enjoyed, as a point of reference in the future. And I guess the question is, who can advocate for that more than the leaders of today's orchestras?
What is your answer to the question, why not new music? And I ask that because there seems to always be so many reasons to not make the so-called main piece on a concert a new work. People will say, oh, well, we want to sell tickets, so we want to make sure audience members have an experience listening to something that they're familiar with. I mean, how far do you think we should go? If I were in control, maybe it would only be new music, but maybe that's throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, I think that, again, just understandably from the common usage of the word new uh, as a qualifier of the word music, there's often an assumption, a mistaken assumption that new means avant-garde, that
Hmm.
new means hermetic,
Right.
that new means unapproachable. Newness is not does not define genre. It doesn't define syntax, doesn't define harmony or rhythm or anything else that's useful. All new connotates is it's of our time. It's now. It's about now. So I think that, I can challenge that assumption rhetorically with words, but I think the most important thing to do is to challenge that assumption with experiences
Mm.
so that when people come to a concert um, and they see, oh, there's a piece that's not Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, Mozart, Shostakovich, whatever it is, it's clearly new. I can see the date in the program that it's, the composer's still alive. But wow, that was not what I expected. That was approachable. That was interesting. That was stimulating. They don't have to like it, but it can be an experience that leaves you with something to, you know, either enjoy or feel that you've explored in a way that was interesting. So while I don't believe that every piece of uh, new music needs to become sort of instantly comprehensible or accessible, it does need to inspire interest
Mm.
and curiosity in a way that audiences feel that they've had an experience that's kind of alive and current, and again, gives them the opportunity to think about their time and what comes next.
So what are you most excited about, whether it's the so-called traditional music, the new music? What are you looking forward to bringing to Charlotte audiences in the coming years?
Um, a lot of variety. Um, I do believe that it's important um, to show people who you are and be authentic with about what you like, and not be shy about telling them why you like it. I think, the part of the role of the conductor is not just to conduct the music, but to present it and to take audiences um, along with you on your journey with what you're putting in front of them. Again, sorry, I keep coming back to food, but it's something really lovely when you sit in a restaurant and you're eating something, whether you like it or not. If the chef comes out and comes to your table to say hello to you and say, "I made this for you." Um, and you can talk about the flavors and how it is reminiscent of his or her childhood, and maybe mama used to make something similar that's been transformed, the past has become the present. you know People like us to understand the story behind things, and so I'm excited about sharing my own very eclectic musical background that has sort of been infused with an sort of the importance of preservation, but also of experimentation to the experiences that I put in front of CSO audiences, and then seeing what comes back and responding to that in real time. I love the prospect of that as a mission.
And of course, the Charlotte Symphony isn't your only post, isn't the only place you make music. How can people learn about some of your other activities outside of Charlotte?
Well, they can go to my website, which is kwameryan.com. And I also occasionally post on Instagram. When I'm excited about a project, I do an Instagram post. I'm not the biggest social media fiend, but I do enjoy sharing on Instagram from time to time. But mostly my website has a lot of blogs. There's actually a podcast on there. I'm not a podcaster of your stature, but I did, during COVID, my project was to do 10 episodes of a podcast where I just talk about things that interested me. It's called 8 Minute Idea. I gave
Mm,
myself 8 minutes to just talk about something that interested me on a clock. So they can get to know me and my sort of crazy thoughts a little bit that way as well.
wonderful, wonderful. Where I wanted to close by going back to Trinidad, where we started. You mentioned that there was a point where you had learned what you could at home, where you had to, go abroad and continue your studies. I wonder what it would take from your perspective to extend that for the next generation. What would it take for someone to be fully prepared for the field without leaving Trinidad? Is that possible? Would that be something that you would invest in or help manifest for those folks?
Well, certainly a lot of progress has taken place in Trinidad since I left. I mentioned that during my childhood, there was this Trinidad and Tobago Opera Society that performed operas once a year. And what I didn't say was that the orchestra for that opera was pulled together from the sort of military band. The wind and brass came from the military band. They pulled together the string players they could find all through the islands, and they imported the conductor from Ireland, I think. Now there's an Academy for the Performing Arts at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. I was its director for 6 years until just 2 years ago. So I thought it was really important for me to go back and give back so that today's young musicians who perhaps don't have the means that I had to just leave and go to boarding school and go to Cambridge could get the tools that they would need to join the profession without having to leave home, at least so early. So yeah, there are a lot more steps in place now for people. They don't need to beam the way I did from the Caribbean to Great Britain to fulfill their dreams.
Maestro Ryan there with the Orchestra Philharmonique de Radio France, conducting the Second Symphony of Henri de Thieu. Hope y'all enjoyed my chat with Kwame. And if you're so moved, hope you'll go support the Charlotte Symphony as he takes the lead there. Huge thanks to Kwame for taking the time to join me today here on the TRILLOQUY podcast. So before the interview, I mentioned getting that peek behind the curtain in the world of orchestral music, right? Well, the big thing it's shown me, among the big things it's shown me, is that this front of house, back of house mentality is presented to musicians in a way that it shouldn't be. When I say front of house, back of house, I'm talking about musicians versus management. When I was playing bassoon professionally, in every orchestra I engaged, there was this clear separation of good guys and bad guys within this musician versus management context. And, as a musician, I went along with it. I assumed that musicians were always right and that we had the true spirit of orchestral music at heart, really pushing this thing forward, and that it's the job of musicians to fight the good fight by opposing management and their focus on the financials. I'll talk about money and how it's getting on my nerves another time, but I wanted to use this time today to address this topic as it relates to the Saint Paul Chamber Orchestra. Today is May 10th, 2024. So about a week ago, their artistic director, who's also a member of the orchestra, stepped down after some disagreements with management. Shortly thereafter, the musicians voted no confidence in the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra's executive director, basically saying that they don't trust the direction that he's taking the organization. Now, full disclosure, this is an organization that I used to do some work for as a speaker, and I was on their board for a very brief time before stepping down. I think I have every reason to side with musicians based on, the way that I'm looking at things and the little bit of inside knowledge that I have. But I decided to just go on their website and look at programming. One of the big reasons I stepped down from the board was that as a board member, I couldn't have any impact on the programming. This was reserved for musicians, the musicians programming committee. Most folks would see that as good. The musicians are choosing what they play. They have autonomy and all that stuff, right? But in my opinion, their ability to program is based on their very colonial conservatory training. You don't get into a job, a position like that without adhering to certain colonial norms when it comes to classical music. And that reflects in the way that they approach programming. I took a look at their upcoming concerts, and not only did I not see the diversity, much less the equity that I think orchestras need to put forward these days, but they have an upcoming concert with not one, but two different Mozart concertos on it. I could go in even more on them, but the point isn't me calling out these people. I just want y'all to understand that when it comes to situations like these, I'm not surprised that managements and orchestras across the country are trying to cut concerts and not give pay raises to the extent that musicians would like, because the programming is just not there. I'm not going to pay to see a double Mozart concert. I don't know who else is. Yes, there are plenty of people who will, but obviously that's not keeping the lights on. Obviously that's not making way for musician raises and extending concerts or even maintaining current concerts. That the proof is in the pudding there. Now, maybe my perspective is just my perspective, but I think 1 + 1 = 2 here. So what's the moral of the story? Orchestras might not make it into the next century if we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to have diverse perspectives in those spaces. And I'm not talking about racial diversity, because these orchestras will find any Black person that they can to push forward their agenda. I'm talking about diversity of thought surrounding this art form. I've really been pushing at my job with the ACO and getting in plenty of arguments and uncomfortable conversations with people, but that's what it takes. It takes that because I see the sun setting on orchestral music in the United States, but that doesn't mean we have to let it happen. It just means that the sun is setting on the status quo we've built around it, and that the future has to look different. Now, it also means that folks like me who have been preaching this gospel for almost a decade, and some for way more, we're continuing to give this pushback, and we're seen as the troublemakers. We're seen as the bad guys, the people without solutions, and the ones just, muddying the waters even more. It reminds me of the Sister Souljah Breakfast Club interview from years ago, where she unpacked this idea of rabble-rousers and troublemakers, agitators, as I'm often called. Here's a little clip from that conversation.
On the plantation, the slave who knew that they weren't really supposed to be a slave and wanted to fight against slavery and wanted to organize the other slaves on the plantation was always the one that they point out, that they string up, that they hang, that they cut off your foot or chop off your tongue, or just choke you to death. So I think of it metaphorically the same way.
And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks as always for listening, and I'll have more for y'all as soon as I can. In the meantime, keep making trouble. Peace.